All right, this is discussion 3B, the second part of the discussion today. I talked last time about the Wittfogel thesis and the idea of hydraulic societies, societies that managed water or had to manage water in massive earthwork systems in order to survive. And so hydraulic societies are sort of a category of societies that use a lot of irrigation, dikes, levees, etc. to catch floodwaters and save them for later to use on agriculture. Now, one of the interesting things about hydraulic societies is they have a really huge environmental impact. Agriculture has a huge environmental impact all by itself, because essentially what happens in agriculture is that a society takes a really diverse ecosystem with all sorts of different plants and animals and things, and they wipe it out in a certain area, a field, and then they plant exactly one plant. And then they work really hard through weeding and other things to try to keep all other plants and animals out of there so that just this one plant can grow. So that's a huge environmental impact. And when you're talking about societies spreading over hundreds of square miles and thousands of square miles, and all of it is just this one crop, you're seriously impacting the environment. But hydraulic societies have even bigger impacts, because they are essentially taking all the water that normally floods through a river system, and they're grabbing it and holding it, and they're creating a bunch of stagnant pools and things, and then they're releasing it on a regular basis. So they're absolutely, utterly shifting how the river functions and what kind of water gets downstream from them and when, and that also can have huge environmental impacts on an ecosystem. So all these hydraulic societies are really fundamentally engineering their ecosystems simply by doing agriculture, especially hydraulic agriculture. And there are a lot of ways this can go wrong, right? And I want to talk about two cases now. One case we're pretty sure exactly what went wrong, and then in another case there's kind of a mystery. So I want to talk about ancient Sumeria. We've been talking about this. This is the area where the Epic of Gilgamesh came from. This is the first civilization I talked about. They were the first to invent agriculture. They domesticated a lot of the original, the basic animals that we think of as domesticated animals. This is the region of these city-states of Ur and Uruk and Lagash and Eridu and Kish. This area, because it was one of the first areas that human beings did agriculture, actually is sort of a laboratory for seeing what hydraulic agriculture does. Now, one of the things that we now know because of modern science is that when you do irrigation agriculture, when you irrigate a system, what you're doing is you're taking a dry environment and you're putting a bunch of water into it that normally isn't there, right? And what's actually interesting is there's an effect that can happen from irrigation, which is called soil salinization. And what essentially happens is that when you saturate the soil, it brings a lot of water, sort of salty water, up to the surface, and then the water evaporates and the salt remains, right? And then now normally that salt would be mixed throughout the soil, but if you bring it all up to the surface with irrigation, you start getting really high levels of soil salinity at the top layer, which is where you're planting your seeds. Now, we also know that wheat is not very tolerant of salt, but barley is much more tolerant of salt. So you can have salt levels, salinity levels in the soil that are about twice as high and still get barley than you could from wheat, right? So wheat starts to just not work very well if the soil salinity starts to rise. Barley works much longer, although there's a limit for barley also. Well, when we look at ancient Sumeria, we see a slow motion environmental disaster happening over centuries. Basically, we have a whole lot of records from a number of ancient cities like Ur and Uruk and Lagash and Kish. And these records, every year they record how much wheat they harvested, how much barley they harvested, on how many acres, etc. So we can track their agricultural production. And when you start at about 3,500, we have records from about 3,500 to about 1,700. So almost 2,000 years. When you start in 3,500, there's about equal amounts of wheat and barley planted. Basically they have different things they do with different grains, and so they like to have both grains, and so they plant about 50-50 wheat and barley. But if you watch those grain tallies over the centuries, you see that it starts to shift. And in particular, by 2500, so over the first 1,000 years, from 3500, it's about 50-50. By 2500, it's more like 85% barley and 15% wheat. All right, so they're shifting towards barley. And that's a clue that maybe the soil is getting, the salinity in the soil is rising, because they're finding that wheat doesn't grow well anymore, and they're shifting to barley because barley can still grow, tolerate higher salt levels. By 2100, for instance, had abandoned wheat altogether. Their harvest is 100% barley, right? And by 1700, nowhere in Sumeria, the entire region, was anybody growing wheat. So basically, over those 2,000 years, they went from growing 50% wheat to growing 0 wheat in the entire region. There's clearly something going on, because it's clear they liked wheat. They were actually importing wheat, but they weren't growing it anymore. So something's going on. Well, we also know that harvests are falling overall. That between 2400 and 1700, which is to say 700 years there, harvests fell over 65%. So they're only getting 35% as much as they did originally. And that's also a result of soil salinization, that the overall harvest is just falling. Even the barley is starting to struggle, right? And to back this up, now you might say, well, there's no proof it was soil salinization, except that we actually have accounts from the time of people talking about the soil turning white. And what that means is they're actually getting a layer of salt on top of the soil. And the salinization is so bad you can see it, right? And so essentially we're pretty sure that what happened to ancient Sumeria was that over 2,000 years of agricultural irrigation, they basically raised the salinity in the soil to levels that they couldn't grow much of anything anymore. And this had political implications. We know that the cities of ancient Sumeria, 3,500 were some of the earliest civilization cities in the world, and they were independent city-states, and they were wealthy, and they were prosperous. But by 2370, which is to say when their wheat production is dropping rapidly, they get conquered by people from farther north. Remember the Assyrians and Babylonians, etc. People from farther north conquer them in 2370, and essentially, I mean, there's some small periods of independence, but essentially ancient Sumeria would be conquered by other peoples for the rest of its history. Right? And by 1700, a lot of these cities were actually shrinking so much they were being abandoned, that people were basically just moving out of the area. Populations were plummeting. So essentially, and if you look at ancient Sumeria today, which is, say, southern Iraq, it's a desert, right? It's not very fertile at all, right? So they essentially, through soil salinization, managed to sort of destroy an ecosystem and destroy their own livelihood and destroy a civilization, right? And so ancient Sumerian civilization was sort of the major civilization in the region in 3500, but after 1700, it's really just a minor arid region that's not very productive, and not very many people live there. Right? So this is a hydraulic civilization producing an environmental disaster. The second case I want to talk about is Harappa. Now, I talked about Harappan civilization in today's lecture, and I talked about how in about 2000 BCE, the civilization started to decline, and by 1500, it was pretty much collapsed. Now, historians are debating what caused this collapse here, because there are basically three culprits. The one is, maybe they had the same problem ancient Sumeria did. Maybe it was soil salinization. We don't have the records for them because we haven't fully deciphered their language yet, so we don't know if that was a problem, if they had white soil and wheat versus barley. We just don't know. So that's one possibility, is that they had exactly the same problem, that they were using massive irrigation and they managed to increase soil salinity so much that their agricultural production collapsed. A second option is the Aryans. I talked about the people from Indo-European speaking peoples from Central, Eastern Europe and Central Asia moving down into India and moving through, and it's possible that they somehow caused the collapse of Harappan civilization. That would imply warfare mostly. And historians are sort of moving away from that one. That one seems less likely that the Aryans just showed up and caused the collapse of Harappan civilization. But there's one other option. A lot of the area now, the Indus River Valley is still densely populated. This is the heart of Pakistan. It's got a lot of people there, a lot of agriculture, et cetera, still uses the Indus River. But the Geiger-Hakra River is essentially dried up, and the region it flows through is essentially a desert now. And so one other option is another form of environmental disaster. You remember Harappan civilization had all those bricks, those magnificent bricks that are all the same size and same ratios and from city to city to city. And that's fantastic. But those bricks are baked, right? And essentially, bricks require significant amounts of fuel, be it coal or wood or whatever, something you can burn to bake the bricks in kilns. And it's quite possible, some historians have suggested, that Harappan civilization, in order to bake all those bricks, essentially deforested its entire region. They cut down all the trees to use for fuel for baking bricks, etc. And because it happened slowly, it was a slow process over hundreds or thousands of years, nobody really noticed, right? Because they were born and there's a certain number of trees, and when any particular person gets old, there's still roughly the same amount of trees. But then, 15, 20 generations down, there's a whole lot fewer trees, but they don't know that because they can't compare it to previous generations. And if they deforested the region, it's entirely possible that they shifted climate patterns or weather patterns. Because trees and forests in particular, they change weather patterns. They cool an area significantly. They create moister air. And so they can actually impact weather patterns. And if you cut down all the trees in a region, it heats up fairly significantly, but in addition, as it heats up and dries out, it can cause cloud formations, etc., to move around it. So it can often cause less rainfall. Just as an anecdotal example of this, I did my graduate work in Southern California, and Orange County, California was named because for a significant portion of the 20th century, it had orange groves everywhere. It was a great orange-producing region. And so in the early 20th century, most of Orange County was orange groves. But gradually, over the course of the 20th century, what happened is that Orange County got turned into suburbs. It's right south of Los Angeles, and so many of the big suburbs of Los Angeles, like Anaheim and Santa Ana and Long Beach, well, actually Long Beach is not in Orange County, but Huntington Beach, Laguna Beach, Newport Beach, these are all in Orange County. And so Orange County became suburban. And essentially, they cut down orange groves and they replaced it with highways and lawns and parking lots. Right? And by the 1990s, the climatologists had noticed that this transformation had actually raised the average temperature in the summer in Orange County by about 1.5 degrees. Imagine a similar process happening in ancient Harappa, that they, over generations, over centuries, they cut down trees. And they cut down more and more trees, and gradually the temperature warms, and the soil dries out, and rainfall stops coming, and it becomes a vicious cycle, right? The more it dries out and heats up, the less rainfall they get, and the less rainfall they get, the more it gets deforested, and then it dries up and heats up. So they might have created an environmental disaster. We don't know, because we don't have enough information about Harappan civilization. But the fact that the Geiger-Hakra River was there and is now a desert, and we even have records back from, the 1000 BC that it was already becoming it was a desert and that there had been a river there, indicates that probably some sort of climate change has something to do with the collapse of Harappan civilization. Whether it was soil salinization, whether it was deforestation, whether it was both, or whether it was something else entirely, we just don't know. But anyway, hydraulic civilizations always have this level of threat that if they manage things badly, they can get soil salinization, they get deforestation, they can cause environmental disasters, and we already have 2 by 1500 BCE.